Now, the Gemara in Masechta Shabbos, after quoting the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai about whether holchin upochsin or holchin umosifin, the Gemara tells a story about two zakenim, two elders that lived in the city of Tzidon. Achad asa kibeit Shammai, the achad asa kibeis Hillel. That itself is remarkable because we usually hold that Beit Shammai etzel Beis Hillel ain't a Mishnah, but apparently Beit Shammai Shita was very, very powerful, and a lot of people took it quite seriously to the extent that, one of the two Zkanim would actually implement the halacha like Beit Shammai. And each one gave an explanation for his Shita. The one who was poches v'holich like Beit Shammai, he said keneged pariacha. The one who was Mosif, he said, Ma'ila b'kodesh v'lo morid. Now, the Gaon Mivilna and many, many others are wondering why the Gemara bothered with this. There's nothing added in halacha by this story. On the contrary, if anything, it's holchim v'pochsim. They're actually reducing what we had early in the Gemara. The Gemara initially had a different explanation for Beis Hillel Beit Shammai, and that is whether keneged yomim hayotzim or keneged yomim hanichnasim. But in any event, the Gaon is amazed that the Rif, who's always interested in paskening halacha lemaisa, he quotes this whole story. He usually leaves out all those Gemaras and reduces it to the final halacha. Why? What halachic significance could there be to this story about the two Zakenim in the city of Tzidon? There's the Gaon that if you look deeper below the surface, there is a halachic import to this story. How so? Because the original first explanation that the Gemara offered for Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai was about Heker Hanes, how to publicize the miracle. Should we publicize the miracle by talking about how many days of miracle there were? So we start with 8. Should we talk about how many days of miracle we need? And we anticipate we start with 1 and we grow up till 8. The second hezber, which the Gemara offered, had nothing to do with Chanukah, nothing to do with Pirsum Hanes. It was operating with universal principles, and this we discussed last time we got together. The name of the Bri Chadash is a universal principle called Ma'ila b'kodesh v'lo moridin. It applies all over the place, all over the show, as opposed to Beis Shammai, who's operating also with a kind of universal halacha of pariachag that certainly has nothing to do, at the face of it, with Chanukah. And now the issue of Pirsum Hanes and Ribui Heker Hanes is completely off the agenda. And therefore, says the Gaon, by accepting the second explanation of Ma'ila b'kodesh versus Pariachag, these Zakenim are taking the Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai out of the picture of Chanukah and Pirsum Nes Chanukah into more universal categories. And therefore, according to these two Zakenim, we don't have to bother ourselves with a Hadlaka Hanikeres, with a Heker, how many days there are to Chanukah. Are there 8 days and how to build up, or we start with 1 day and then we build up. All that is irrelevant to the Machlokas Beis Hillel Beit Shammai. And Beis Hillel Beit Shammai are operating with universal categories, whether or not we should go from higher numbers to lower numbers or from lower numbers to higher numbers. And therefore, all the issues that, for example, we discussed last week, the machlokas between Tosfos and the Rambam, about how to achieve through the Mahadrin, Min Mahadrin, the highest level, the maximum level of Pirsum Hanes, of Heker Hanes. Should we drop the Mahadrin and go back to the Ikar Mitzvah and Ner Echadu Beso and then build a Mahadrin on the lowest level of Ikar Mitzvah? Or should we have both Mahadrin and Mahadrin Min Mahadrin, as is the Shittas HaRambam? All that becomes irrelevant there is no pushing reason to even enter into the issue of heker this way, heker that way, because Mahadrin is based on different categories that are irrelevant and independent of Ribui Heker Anes. And therefore, the Rif, who actually is on the side of the Rambam in this machlokas about Mahadrin bin Mahadrin, and the Rif is of the opinion that you have Mahadrin and then you build Mahadrin bin Mahadrin on top of Mahadrin. What gave the Rif the right to paskin like that and ignore the fact, as Tosfos argues, that once you have both Mahadrin and Mahadrin bin Mahadrin, then the Heker Anes goes down because the spectator, he doesn't know why you added so many candles. Did you add these candles because there are more Bnei Abayis and therefore you're reflecting the Mahadrin? Did you add candles because of the Keneged HaYomim and therefore you are increasing the number of candles and that's the Heker Anes? All that, the arguments of Tosfos that we can't have a cake and eat it too. We cannot have both Mahadrin and as well simultaneously Mahadrin bin Mahadrin. Those arguments could only be relevant in the first explanation of Esil Beit Shammai, which means that the Mahadrin is to expand the Heker Anes. But if we drop the ball on that explanation, as did the Rif, and why did the Rif do so? Because of the story of the two Zakanim, each one justified his shita based on universal principles that have nothing to do with Chanukah, then forget about Tosfos' argument about how could you have both the Mahadrin bin Mahadrin and at the same time the Mahadrin. That is the approach of the Gaon. And the Gaon, I just want to point out, is really beneficial for us on two levels. First of all, to justify why the Rif in a very atypical way would bother quoting this story. He never quotes stories. That's not his issue. And number two, why does the Gemara bother with this story? The story doesn't add anything. But the answer is that this story subtracts something, and that could have a justifying power to explain why the Rif is not bothered by Tosfos' objection. How can you build Mahadrin bin Mahadrin on top of Mahadrin and have both at the same time? All those questions are based on a premise which is not true, namely that the purpose of the Mahadrin is to increase and embellish Heker Anes. No. The Mahadrin has to do with something else entirely. It has to do with Hosofas, Neros. It has to do with Parei Achad, going down. These are universal principles, and they have nothing to do with Chanukah nor with Heker Anes. Fine. Now, if you have the pages that we sent out, and again, I want to thank David. I hope he's feeling good. I see David here. I think it's him. Unless there's somebody else with the same name. You know, two Shimon ben Shimon's, but Yossi ben Shimon. We move on now to page 54. And on page 54, we have a very fascinating machlokes on top of a machlokes, so to speak. And here's the issue. Let's take the case of Mahadrin. Ner l'chol echad v'echad. Who is lighting those extra neros that reflect the number of people in the house? The Rambam seems to indicate that it's the Madlik himself, one man show as I call it, who's adding candles and fulfilling the Mahadrin. So that if there are 10 Bnei Abayis on the first night, the Madlik, says the Rambam, will light 10 candles, one corresponding to each member of the household. However, the Ramah says no, that how do we fulfill the mitzvah of Mahadrin? Kol echad v'echad mibnei abayis yadlik liatzma. Every individual should light his own candle. Kol echad v'echad. So that it comes out that there's another machlokas here that you can miss, and it could sort of fall between the cracks. The Rambam holds that it's only the Baal Bayis who's being the Madlik. And the Ram is very consistent, whether it's Ner Echad Lebayis, it's the Baal Bayis. Even if it's Ner L'Kol Echad V'Echad, it's still the Baal Bayis. And even if it's Mahadrin Bin Mahadrin to add Keneged Yomim Hayotzim, Yogan HaChnasim, it's always the Baal Bayis. On the other hand, the Ramah is very excited about the Mahadrin because he wants to get everyone involved personally in the Ma'aseh Mitzvah in lighting the candles, so that each one should light his own candle. And at this point, we introduce a Chiddush of the Brisker Rav. So this is halfway down page 54. Brisker Rav says that the Rambam and the Ramah are really going l'shitasam. This is not a new machlokas as to whether there was one madlik or each one mahadrin should light for himself. This is a what we call l'shitaso. This is both the Rambam and the Ramah, each one respectively going consistently with his shita. And at this point, we can take a little bit of a step back because the Brisker Rav is going to introduce a major issue in Hiddur Mitzvah. And the plantation, the field of plantation for this machlokas is not in Chanukah, but rather in Bris Milah. And this is the sugya in Masechta Shabbos, I think it's Kuf Lamed Gimel, which is called Tzitzin She'enon Ma'akvim Es HaMilah. Means that there are certain skins that even if you leave it behind and it wasn't cut during Milah, it's Eino Ma'akiv. There are certain tzitzim that are Ma'akiv, that are absolutely critical. You have to cut them. But there are other parts of the foreskin that comes under the geder of Hiddur Mitzvah, meaning a good Moel will do all its tzitzim, even those that are ma'akvim, he'll make sure to make his incision in that way. But b'di'eved, or even l'chatchila, but without Hiddur Mitzvah, there's no concern about the tzitzin she'enon ma'akvim es hamil. Okay. Now, we have a gigantic machlokas between Rashi and the Rambam on this Gemara in Masechta Shabbos. The Gemara establishes that with regard to tzitzin she'enon ma'akvim, and slow me down if I go too fast, then chozer aleim, he should go back and cut them mishum Hiddur Mitzvah, but only, says the Gemara, b'medvar mamurim, as long as the moel is still involved in the Ma'aseh Milah. He's adayin osek the Ma'aseh Milah. Piresh min Milah. Let's say he made his incision, leaving certain tzitzim, which are not critical, but he left them attached to the body, to the membrane. And now he wants to go back after he completed the Milah. He was Masalik es Yadav and cut the tzitzin she'eino ma'akvim. Shuv eino chozer. He does not go back to cut the tzitzin she'eino ma'akvim. Why? Because silek es yad. He's not involved in the Milah, the original Ma'aseh Milah. Rashi and the Rambam are going to argue as to whether or not this halacha that piresh min Milah shuv eino chozer al tzitzin she'eino ma'akvim, is that halacha in Shabbos or halacha in Milah? The entire chapter, which is called Rebbe Lezer de Milah, addresses the issue of the 8th day of the baby's birth on a Shabbos. So the 8th day, which is called Milah Bismana, was on Shabbos. The Torah says, B'yom hashmini yimol es b'sar oloso, and the Gemara says, Afilu b'Shabbos. Rashi learns that cutting the Milah is a violation of Shabbos, which the Torah permits for the sake of the mitzvah of Milah. As long as the moel is involved in the Ma'aseh Milah, v'lo silek es yadav, then the entire Ma'aseh mitzvah even though the tzitzin she'enim ha'akfim are part of Hiddur mitzvah, it's all one enterprise. It's one continuous, non-stop Ma'aseh Milah that goes from Ikar Milah to Hiddur mitzvah, and it all overrides the Shabbos. But, says Rashi, in interpreting the Gemara, Kevan shepirish min hamilah, once he completes the Ma'aseh Milah, now he wants to go back and cut tzitzin she'enim ha'akfim. That's a violation of Shabbos for the sake of Hiddur mitzvah. Rashi interprets that for the sake of the Ikar mitzvah, Yom HaShmini afilu b'Shabbos, that overrides the Shabbos. But Hiddur mitzvah will not override the Shabbos. Again, let's understand. According to Rashi, no question about it, if he would go back after he was piresh min hamilah and cut the tzitzin she'enim ha'akfim, he would be embellishing the mitzvah. That's not a question. But Hiddur mitzvah is not docha Shabbos. It doesn't override the Shabbos. So now Rashi says we have to decide if he's going back on tzitzin she'enim ha'akfim hamilah toch kidei ma'aseh hamilah, then it's docha Shabbos. It's all part of one continuous ma'aseh milah. If he's already completed the milah and he was poresh min hamilah, now he's going back to cut tzitzin she'enim ha'akfim solely for the exclusive purpose of Hiddur mitzvah, and that does not override the Shabbos. But again, if it was a weekday, and this would happen, that after the Moel already was poresh min hamilah, he reminds himself, hey, there's still tzitzin over here. All right, they're not ma'akiv. He should go ahead and cut those tzitzin for the sake of what? Hiddur mitzvah. Shabbos is a problem because Hiddur mitzvah does not override the Shabbos. Ad kan Rashi. The Rambam, on the other hand, says that this Gemara here in Masechta Shabbos, again, it happens to be in Masechta Shabbos, but the Gemara has nothing to do with Shabbos. It applies the whole week long. Whenever a Moel is involved in Milah, if he was poresh min hamilah without cutting tzitzit she'enim ha'akfim, ain't no choser. Why? Because the Rambam holds that the Gemara is defining Hiddur mitzvah. What is Hiddur mitzvah? It means to embellish the Ma'aseh mitzvah, which could either mean the way he does the action, or it could mean the chefza on which he does it. Many different possibilities, but it's got to all be within the framework of the Ma'aseh mitzvah. Once the Ma'aseh mitzvah is complete, he was already yotzei yidei chovasa. You can't have a separate action on Ma'aseh for the purpose of Hiddur mitzvah. The Rambam therefore holds that once it was pirush min hamilah, eino chozer al tzitzin she'enim ha'akfim hamilah afilu b'chol, because he's already forfeited the possibility of Hiddur mitzvah. So we have now a fundamental machlokas between Rashi and the Rambam about Hiddur mitzvah. Rashi holds that you can have a separate Ma'aseh. You've completed the Ikar mitzvah, and with this second action, you fulfill Hiddur mitzvah because it embellishes the mitzvah that you did earlier. The Rambam holds, on the other hand, that it's pointless and it's impossible to add Hiddur mitzvah once the original Ma'aseh mitzvah was done and complete. Hence the nafkamina during the week in a case of tzitzin she'enim ha'akfim hamilah. Says the Brisker Rav, and here we're on the bottom of page 55, that the Rambam in Hilchas Chanukah is l'shitasa. Why does the Rambam require that for the sake of Mahadrin, it's the madlik, the balabayas, he's going to light the extra candles keneged the yanshe bayis, because once he completes his hadlaka, now you're going to give the hadlaka over to another member of the household. The Ma'aseh mitzvah was complete because Ikar mitzvah is ner ishu beis, so one ner for the entire house. Now you have a new Ma'aseh hadlaka. For what purpose? For Mahadrin? The Rambam says you cannot have a Mahadrin if the Ma'aseh mitzvah was already complete. It's like the case of piresh min hamilah. When you're going from, let's say you have Reuven and Shimon, the two brothers in the house. So when you're going from Ruvain's Hadlaka to Shimon's Hadlaka is after Pireish Min HaMilah, meaning after the Ma'aseh Mitzvah was complete. And therefore the Rambam had a problem. How do we understand Mahadran? The entire enterprise of Mahadran and Er Chanukah, according to the Rambam's understanding, wouldn't make sense unless it's all one Madlik. If Ruvain is lighting as the Baal Bayis, representing the entire house, and on the first night, he's not going to suffice with one candle, he's going to add another candle for his brother Shimon, then it's all part of one Meisad Laka. And therefore you can fulfill Hiddur Mitzvah. On the other hand, if you go like Rashi, and apparently the Ramah, we'll see soon, accepted the sheet of Rashi in Masechta Shabbos, that you could have Hiddur Mitzvah even after the Ma'aseh Mitzvah was complete. Therefore, it's not necessary to say that the Madlik himself should continue to the second candle because he has another member of the household. There's no need for that. Let the Madlik complete his Ma'aseh Laka, and now we embellish the mitzvah when another member of the household will light his own candle. Joe?
I'm sorry, I don't understand how you can learn it, you can compare it to Shabbos. In that situation, we have a negative going against it, a massive negative of an Isser Raisa, the Chayav Nisa if you're going to be doing the cutting. Here, that's why that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no Hiddur whatsoever involved.
Hey, Joe, apparently I did not explain myself well. Listen carefully. According to the Rambam, the Gemara in Shabbos has nothing to do with Shabbos. It has to do with defining Hiddur Mitzvah. The Rambam holds that even during the week, a Moel does not go back on Tzitzin She'eno Ma'akfin if he was Paresh Min HaMilah. Why? Because the Rambam holds that once the Ma'aseh Mitzvah was complete, there is no Hiddur Mitzvah. That has nothing to do with Shabbos. And if we apply that to Chanukah, then the Rambam has a problem with Mahadran and Chanukah because the Ma'aseh Mitzvah is complete with Ruvain's Hadlaka. Now Shimon is going to start his Hadlaka. It cannot be integrated into the original Hadlaka. It's not a Hiddur Mitzvah at all. And the only way the Rambam could figure out and justify Mahadran and Chanukah would be to say if the Madlik is continuing with his Hadlaka. Hence, it's one long Ma'aseh Mitzvah where he lights two candles, one for himself and one on behalf of Shimon. Rashi, on the other hand, says that if it would have been a weekday, then who cares if he was Paresh Min HaMilah? He wants to be Mekayim Hiddur Mitzvah. Let him go ahead and start a brand new Milah, only for the purpose of Tzitzin, and in this case, Tzitzin She'eno Ma'akfin, but that itself will be a kiyum of Hiddur Mitzvah, despite the fact that it's a brand new Ma'aseh Milah. And therefore, Rashi would have no compunctions about Mahadran and Chanukah, because even if Reuven completed his Hadlaka, Shimon, now another member of the household, will do his Hadlaka, and hence we increase the mitzvah, embellish the mitzvah with Keneged Anshe Habayis. It's an incredibly profound briskara.
Shouldn't you have one bracha according to that?
According to the Rambam, there'll only be one bracha. Now you're asking, according to Rashi, maybe we should say that if you already were Mekayim in one Ma'aseh Mitzvah, the Iker Kiyum, so now maybe we need a new bracha for the new Ma'aseh Mitzvah when Shimon now lights the, first Reuben made the bracha. Again, there may be two answers to your question. One answer is that Shimon should be listening to the bracha of Reuben, but I think more profoundly, we could say that according to Rashi, since the new action of Hadlaka is upgraded to the status of Hadlakas Ner Chanukah, because Rashi holds you could have a new Maisa which qualifies as Hadlakas Ner Chanukah, and it's a kiyum of Zeh Kelim Yameyu of Hiddur Mitzvah, maybe you can make a bracha on that. But that again touches on a whole different issue about whether we make a bracha on Hiddur Mitzvah. And the truth is that question is relevant even according to the Rambam. If let's say the Rambam holds that he was madlik two candles on the first night, one for himself and one for one of the other Bnei Abayis, and he forgot to make the bracha when he lit his own candle. Can he make the bracha on the Hiddur Mitzvah? That's again a very interesting, a different dimension of Hiddur Mitzvah. We're not going to cover all of Hiddur Mitzvah today. I mamish don't hear what you're saying. I mean, I hear the noise, but I can't. Can you say it again?
Sorry, no, it was the phone was ringing.
I thought somebody was.
The other thing was also with hefsek. Like, in other words, if it's all one mitzvah really, then we should be makbid that there shouldn't be a hefsek between each of the lightings of the menorahs.
Well, I'll tell you, Bobby, you're asking according to the Rambam. I'm even more perplexed according to Rashi, because according to Rashi, what would happen? Imagine, shtel zechvar, as we say, Ruvain lights one candle on the first night at 7 p.m. And Shimon comes along at 8 p.m. and he lights a second candle. And Rashi's holding that that's a kiyum of Hiddur mitzvah. I mean, ein l'davar sof. How many years later can the Moel come and cut the tzitz and shenim ha'akfin and call it Hiddur mitzvah according to Rashi? According to the Rambam, it's a little bit better because the Rambam is holding this one ma'asad laka on the part of one madlik. And you're right, he should be careful not to be mafsik. It shouldn't come to the point of piresh min adlaka, paralleling piresh min amila, and you'd have to go into the nuances and define exactly at what point does it become piresh min amila. And you're right, there should be adlaka of one ner and then following the other ner, but it's all one madlik. The fact that there's one madlik is mitzarev, and it links and integrates the two hadlakos together into one hadlaka, which the Rambam requires in order to achieve Hiddur mitzvah. Because if you can't integrate these two actions into one long mitzvah, then you've already blown it. It's too late for Hiddur mitzvah. And the Ramah, it's very interesting. The Ramah would hold that the hadlaka of the Bnei Habayis, if you take a look on the bottom of page 55, about 5 lines up before the bottom, is a Maisa Bifnei Atzmo. It's unbelievable. The Ramah is going as far as to say that each hadlaka of each one of the Bnei Abayis is hadlaka Bifnei Atzmo. And yet, somehow, magically, it integrates into one mitzvah, such that you can have a kiyum of Hiddur mitzvah. And in truth, the Ramah is l'shitaso, because in Hilchas Mila, the Ramah Paskins, okay, now we're learning Yeridea, Hilchas Mila, and the Ramah Paskins in Hilchas Mila, that even in a case where the Mo was Masalik es Yada on a weekday, Choser al tzitzin shenim ha'akfin. Meaning that the Ramah understood, like Rashi, that the problem with Silek es Yadav in Tzitzit Shenim Ha'akfin is a Shabbos problem. But indeed, on a weekday, the halacha would require the Moel, even after he was Mesalik es Yadav min Amila, Choser al Tzitzin she'enan ma'akfin es Amila. The Ramah paskins explicitly in Hilchas Mila, like Rashi, that even after Silek es Yadav, you can still fulfill Hiddur mitzvah on Tzitz and Shenim Ha'akfin, even though it's a brand new Ma'aseh Mila. And therefore, the Ramah has no problem if on Chanukah, each person is lighting his own ner. And that's indeed how the Ramah paskins in Hilchas Chanukah. Every member of the household should be lighting his own candle.
But he wouldn't say that you should make another bracha when you do the tzitz and shenim ha'akfin. Berzon, he wouldn't say that you.
Yeah, I heard you, Bobby. I'm letting it sink a little bit. No, it's.
I thought I was muted.
On Zoom it takes a little longer to sink. I'm just joking. I would say the following, and I'm going to quote my Rebbe in a minute that may possibly strengthen what I want to say, maybe. Rashi and the Ramah recognize Hiddur mitzvah as a separate Ma'aseh mitzvah. You've already completed the first Maisa mitzvah. You have achieved, the check in the box, and yet you can still go ahead and improve and embellish that mitzvah with a separate Maisa, and that's called Zeh Keli V'Amveu Hiddur mitzvah. However, if you ask me the question, which I think, Bobby, you're touching on about the bracha, I would say the following. What exactly are you doing now in the second Maisa, which is Hiddur? Are you duplicating the first Maisa, or are you just adding something to it? And indeed, something that is secondary and not primary, it's not critical. So there's A and B. A is a scenario where you completed the mitzvah, but now you want to embellish the mitzvah with Hiddur mitzvah, but you are duplicating the original Maisa mitzvah. B, another scenario, is where you are extending and embellishing the Maisa mitzvah after you completed the Maisa mitzvah, but you're not duplicating and reiterating the Maisa mitzvah. Herein lies the difference between Tzitzin, Sheina Ma'akvin, and Mila, and the Hadlaka of each one of the Bnei Abayis as a separate Maisa Hadlaka. It's possible that in the case of Chanukah, I'm going to go backwards here, from Chanukah back to Mila, there is justification for each member of the family, possibly, to recite his own bracha. Why? Because here the Hiddur mitzvah is a duplication of the mitzvah. We're like starting the mitzvah from scratch. Imagine if, let's say, you had two menorahs. One menorah was inferior quality, and the other was, I was about to say Hungarian, but I'll leave that word out. But the other one was a very fancy menorah. Right? So maybe you could say a bracha on the fancy menorah, even though you were Yotzei Likra mitzvah, because you're duplicating the Maisa mitzvah and you're carrying a Hiddur mitzvah. Because now you have a menorah that's pure gold. But in the case of Tzitzin, I don't believe for one moment that Rashi would justify making a bracha on Tzitzin Sheina Ma'akvin Hamila. That's not a Maisa Mila. That's a removal of the Tzitzin, and the Mila is done with. And I think Rav Soloveitchik once said, I remember, that the Ramah in Chanukah, in Mahadrin, holds that the mitzvah itself changed. That's how far Rav Soloveitchik went to explain this Ramah. The mitzvah through Hiddur underwent a change, a fundamental change. The Ikar mitzvah is on the bias. And the Ramah understood that the Hiddur mitzvah is on the Gavra. You have a Chovas bias and a Chovas Gavra. And the Ramah wants to make this transition, embellishing the mitzvah by upgrading the mitzvah from a level of Chovas bias, where all the members of the household join together with one Adlaka, to a level of Chovas Gavra, that my body, each one of the members of the household, my body should be physically involved in the Maisa Adlaka. And if that be the case, maybe the answer to your question, Bobby, is yes. The Ramah would allow a bracha for each member of the household, even though all the mitzvah is only Hiddur mitzvah, but Hiddur mitzvah in this case changes and alters the essence of the definition of the mitzvah. Okay.
Yeah, Esrig.
When you say the word esrog, I have a lot of things that go through my mind. First of all, Reb Chaim used to test his students. He used to put two esrogim on the table. You remember this? One esrog was basic, but it was a vadai esrog. The other was beautiful, beautiful esrog, but it might have been a murkov. It might not have been an esrog at all. It was a lemon. So he asked his Talmidim, which one of these two esrogim should you take first? And all the Talmidim said, for sure, take the one that's vadai kosher. No. Said Reb Chaim, take the one that's safek kosher. Because if you take the one that's vadai kosher, then you've already fulfilled your mitzvah and you forfeited either mitzvah. But if you take the one that's a safek, then if you got it right and you won the prize, the Russian roulette, then you got Hiddur mitzvah as well for the bargain. If in the worst case scenario you took a lemon, so that immediately afterwards, without a hefsek, obviously, so you don't want to miss the bracha, you can now be Mekayim the mitzvah on a basic level. But when you say esrog, You remind me of Rashi at the beginning of Lulav HaGozel. You remember that Rashi says something which is just boggles the mind. Rashi says Lulav HaYavesh is possible because of Zeh Keli Anveu. And Tosas right away jumps on it. We never found that Zeh Keli Anveu is ma'akev in the mitzvah. So let's say you add an Esrog HaYavesh, Rashi would claim that it's possible midin Zeh Keli Anveu. He can design. How can you say such a thing? Okay, but that's for another shir. So I don't know what you meant by Esrog.
But my point would be, based on what we're saying, that if you took an esrog that was not mahudr, and then you got another esrog that was mahudr, if you're saying that there's another
and according
mitzvah,
to Rashi, you could make a bracha, like the case of the menorah. All of a sudden, you inherited a menorah that's worth 10,000, at least Canadian dollars. I don't know exactly, but it's a very expensive menorah.
Right.
I always tell the story when I was dating. It goes back a couple of years. I went out with a girl from Borough Park, and it happened to be Chanukah. She was actually at her uncle's house in Borough Park, and they were about to light Ner Chanukah. So the uncle says to me, "Come and join us, and then you'll go out with my niece." I can't begin to describe the menorah. In fact, you had to jump on a step in order to reach this gigantic menorah. It's like the menorah in Ben Gurion Airport. It makes the Chabad menorahs that roll around on the thing look small. And when I walked out of the house, again, this can only happen in Borough Park, but anyway, I said to myself, this is Hamaratzis. Who says that the menorah is a chefza shel mitzvah and there's a kiyum of Zeh Keli Anveu? 25 years later, there's an organization here, maybe you've seen it, called Moriah Publications. They published a ksav yad of the Ravid, the Baal HaSagas. And in that piece, he writes that if you were to take a candle and put it on top of the table and light it, you have not fulfilled the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. You have to put it into a menorah as the nes took place in the Mikdash. 25 years later, Lemafreya, I appreciated that beautiful menorah from Borough Park. And a menorah is a chefza shel mitzvah. All right, now
just to finish up with what Bobby was saying, just the could you also not say that with regards to Pesumei Nisa, that adds to it that everybody's, once you're lighting again, you have
Pesumei Nisa.
What?
More
Pesumei Nisa.
You expand the Pesumei Nisa.
That's right. Not like with the Nesrog, it's not the same kind of thing.
Right. But again, just to expand Pesumei Nisa here, and nothing against Chabad. My roots are in Chabad, so I can't. But just to light a candle for Pesumei Nisa, that's it could be on the lawn of the White House. That's not a mitzvah. No offense.
Right. I understand.
So that according to the Shita of the Rambam, I would agree with you that if each member of the household lights his own candle, that expands the Pirsum HaNes. But it's not a Maisa mitzvah because the mitzvah has already been achieved when one member of the household will call the Balabayas with the candle. Yeah. So it's very nice that you're expanding Pirsum HaNes. According to Rashi, Shita would say, Joe is very exciting because according to Rashi, you can expand the mitzvah with a kiyum of Zeh Keli Anveu even after you completed the Maisa mitzvah. So when Shimon now lights his candle as a separate brand new Maisa mitzvah, it expands the Pirsum HaNes. Okay. I'm just going to try to do something here to get a little bit more quiet, from the background music here. I don't know, it doesn't work. Anyway. Rabbosai, we are now about to embark upon a very interesting journey with Rabbi David Minavardik, the Galia Masechta. And that starts on page 56 and continues to page 58 of the Hegyonei Halacha. As it happens to be, I have here in my library the original printing of the Galia Masechta from 1840. And I only mention this to you because I had a lot of trouble figuring out this Hegyonei Halacha. Usually Hegyonei Halacha is smooth. His pedagogy is tops. But here I got stuck. And I would like to take you along for that ride. Maybe you'll figure out the Galia Masechta. I couldn't figure it out until I opened up my copy of the Galia Masechta. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
What is bothering the Galia Masechta? There's a major machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos about the following issue, which I know here in Israel, it's like the most relevant, common issue in Ner Chanukah. I really hold like that. Probably in your Gegen as well. Where do you light the Ner Chanukah? Here are your two options. You have many batim, anyone who went to Erevin will appreciate this, many batim that spill into a common courtyard. That's called a chutzah. Now, if you're outside the chutzner, you belong to the public area, you enter into the chutzner through a Pesach. On the other hand, every house within that chutzner has its own Pesach. So we have two Pesachim. We have Pesach Beiso and Pesach Chatzero. Is that clear? Where should you light Ner Chanukah? I have it here in Sholzin number 16, where I'm talking to you now. I have Pesach Beiso. And then if you climb up 2 flights, you get to Pesach HaChotzer, which is a common courtyard shared by 16 families in this building. My only problem in this 16 families is that I don't speak Spanish. All right. I was thinking of learning Spanish. Aprendo la escuela 2 años, but of course I forget every word of Spanish that they taught me in high school, because my high school Spanish teacher knew less Spanish than we did, but that's a different story. So this becomes a major issue, a plugta between Rashi and Tosfos. And Rashi advocates lighting b'Pesach Beiso, right outside the opening to the entranceway to his house. Tosfos advocates lighting the Pesach HaChotzer. Where do we see this machlokes? How did the Galia Masechta discover this machlokes? The Gemara tells us a little bit later on in the sugya that mitzvah leniach haneros al Pesach Beiso mibachutz. And Rashi and Tosfos argue about what is going on. What is the case of the Gemara? Rashi holds that the Gemara is talking about a case of a bias that opens up into a common courtyard, and the Gemara is establishing that despite the fact that there's a Pesach to the Choter, which is common to all the Bnei Abayis, he should light the Pesach Beiso, not the Pesach HaChotzer. So again, Rashi reads the words, Mitzvah laniach haneros al Pesach Beiso mibachutz, means in front of his own house, his own private entranceway. Lafuke Pesach Chatzero. Tosfos, Dibra Maskell Mitzvah lanicha, says the Gemara is talking about a Pesach that opens into Rishus HaRabim. And when it says Meiniach al Pesach Beiso, it means the Pesach of his house that leads into a Rishus HaRabim. And therefore, says the Galia Masechta, according to Tosfos, we would advocate that in this case, he should light the Pesach HaChoter rather than Pesach HaBamas. Again, that's a paragraph unto itself. We're going to focus now on Tosfos' Shita, Pesach Chatzero. But I'm just pointing out to you that, we would probably have to spend hours racking our brains on the machlokas between Rashi and Tosfos here about Pesach Beso versus Pesach Hatzero, and then check out the poskim, because this, as I said, is a very, very common issue. I would possibly say that if you live in a residential area, which is private homes, it's less of an issue. But if you live in an apartment building with a common chotzer, it's very relevant. And during the time of the Gemara, it was very, very relevant because, as you know from learning Erefin, there was a common situation of a chotzer that was shared by many, many different bodies. Says the Galia Masechta, I don't understand Tosfos' Shita. How could it possibly be that all the Bnei HaChotzer are going to converge on the Pesach HaChotzer, and as many homes and households as you have, they're all going to light in the same place? Now, let me add a footnote over here. When we say they're all lighting in the same place, they didn't have menorahs like we do. They had a menorah for each ner. Each ner had its own menorah. It was a receptacle that was made out of a kli cheres, and you can learn the sugyas of muktzah with regard to these small receptacles. And basically, could you imagine, this is what the Galia Masechta is asking us to picture in our mind. You've got X number of batim. They're all setting up their candles at the Pesach HaChotzer, a common Pesach HaChotzer. Wait a second. Tosfos just told us that if you want to be Mekayim the Mahadrid, Mina Mahadrid, which means that you want to add a candle, like they say, for each additional night, then drop the Mahadrid. Right? You can't have your cake and eat it, as we said. You cannot be Mekayim the Mahadrid. Why? Because if you're going to be Mekayim the Mahadrid, which means you're going to add candles for the Bnei Abayis, then on top of that, you're adding candles for the days. There's no hecker. Nobody's going to be able to figure out whether or not your extra candles indicate the extra days or the extra members of the household. Who knows? Where's the hecker here? Therefore, Tosfos says, on the Mizbeach here, we have to sacrifice and shech the carbon, which is called the Mahadrin, for the sake of the Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin. And Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin is the ultimate ideal level, but you should know it replaces the Mahadrin. Why? Again, the logic of Tosfos that compels Tosfos is that it's impossible to have both Mahadrin and Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin, because where's the hecker and this? The onlooker thinks that the extra candles that you lit on the second day past the first day is not indicative of the extra nest that happened on the second day, that the Shemin nested the second day, but rather it's indicative of the Bnei Abayis. So drop the Mahadrin in favor of the Mahadrin bin Mahadrin. Says the Galia Masechta, wait a minute, but Tosfos is telling me that all the Bnei HaChotzer should converge on the Pesach HaChotzer. They're going to be zillions of candles over there. Who can figure out what is the extra candles? What are they? Are they Keneged Anshe Abayis? Or do they reflect the Yomim Hanifnosim Yom HaYotzim? It doesn't make any sense. If Tosfos is advocating in favor of Bnei Achot, of Pesach HaChotzer, then it must mean that Tosfos is dropping the ball on Heker and Nes, and then therefore I don't know why he has to remove the Mahadrin in favor of the Mahadrin Mina Mahadrin. Brilliant, brilliant question of the Galia Masechta, who lived about almost 2 centuries ago. So the Galia Masechta says, wait a minute. You know where the answer to the solution to this problem lies? It lies in the old issue between the Rambam and the Ramah that we discussed at great length. How to fulfill the mitzvah Mahadrin. Is each person lighting his own candle, or is it one madlik? And he's medayik in the Rambam, as we did before. The Rambam over and over and over again indicates that is one madlik b'lashon yachid. It's only in the singular. The Rambam never speaks about madlikin. And madlik Ner l'chol echad v'echad means that he, the Balabayas, and only the Balabayas, is adding candles to correspond to the number of the household members. The Ramah, on the other hand, says, no, you want to be Makayim the Mahadrim, says the Ramah, Kol echad v'echad mibrei habayis yadlik bi'atzmo haneros. The Galia Masechta, believe it or not, believes that Tosfos holds like the Rambam and not like the Ramah. And he's medayik in Tosfos in a number of places that Tosfos, like the Rambam, only uses the singular, madlik, which means that Tosfos agrees with the Rambam on this major point about how to fulfill and implement the Mahadrim. Namely, that there should be one madlik, the Balbais will light, and the number of candles will reflect and correspond to the number of people in the bayis. And now, Rabbi David of Navardik is going, the Baal Galia Masechta is going to answer our question about the chutz, about the Pesach HaChutz. And this you'll follow me, if you can, on page 57 in the Hegyonei Halacha. He says the following. What was the Galia Masechta's question? Im kol alei abatim, all the homeowners, shebachotzer, that share the same courtyard, yadliku, al pesach shara chotzer, lo yeh heker l'nes. Where's the heker here? It's just masses of numbers of candles. Again, this whole discussion would change in our time when there were menorahs. Now we could separate one menorah from the other, but in that times they had a kli cheres for each ner. There's the Galia Masechta, line 3, on page 57. And here I need your help. Kevon shadlocha also mitzvah. What does that mean? Another sugya, which we're not covering, and that is everything in Chanukah depends upon the moment of the Maisa Hadloch. There's another sheet in the Gemara called Hanochos Mitzvah. We pass in Hadlochos Mitzvah. Nimtza. She'ikar a heker, the heker that Tosfos wants to achieve, and that's why he sacrifices Mahadrin for the sake of Mahadrin, Minamahadrin. Tzarech sheyeh b'shas Hadloch. Everything depends upon the moment of Hadloch. Vimkein. Okay, we'll call him Reuven. Reuven is the father of one particular house that shares that chotzer. V'yadlik neirosov v'pesach hachotzer. And who's going to be lighting that? Only the madlik, only Reuven, because we're going now that Tosfos agrees with the Rambam that only the madlik adds the candles. Haresha b'shas hadloka yesh heker l'nes. Okay, I can accept that. Shadloka also mitzvah v'daya. Okay, but now that's Reuven representing one bias. V'chein kishayovo balabayis sheni. Now we have Shimon representing another bias that shares the same courtyard. Vishlishi, and we have Levi. I don't get it. I mean, all right, Reuven, I could survive. He got there first, called a code of Zoch. But how does this help me for Shimon and Levi, for example? Sheni and the Shlishi. I don't get it. There's something missing here in the text. He says, now that there's only one madlik, if he would try to achieve both Mahadrin and Mahadrin in Mahadrin, then there's no Heker L'nes, because again, we don't know what are these extra candles. Are they extra members of the household? Or the extra nights of Chanukah? Sharoli lo yakirim tosefes haneros mishum hayomim o mishum b'nei abayis, ribui b'nei abayis. Is it the yomim or is it the ribui b'nei abayis? I'm lost over here. I understand, again, Rabbosai, I have no problem with Reuven. But what about Shimon and Levi? I mean, each one of the households are going to light candles here. Where's the hecker? The whole thing is mishkababbled. I mean, there are candles and candles all over the place. And he invokes the principle of adlakos and mitzvah. Very, very unclear. One of the rare occasions I want to write a letter to my good buddy, Rabbi Yitzchak Mirsky, and say, Rebbe, you didn't clarify this. You left me hanging. Joe, you haven't?
First of all, I'm sorry about one finger. I got too close to Bobby when he was eating his breakfast. Sorry. No, just kidding.
I see.
I know. I just
look. You're lucky. You only ate one finger.
I'm just. Could you not say that he's talking about that you have to watch the entire lighting? So in other words, the person who's lighting, you see all the candles that he's lighting. And you know which ones. Once the next guy lights, you count the amount of candles that he's lighting.
Okay, very good. I like that, Joe. And here I have the Galia Masechta in front of me. And it's a whole nother experience when you go back to the original. And again, unfortunately, we're running out of time, but let me see. I'm under the gun here. I myself have to take care of davening and lighting my candles. And then, okay, so he says the following. Okay, so he has a paragraph that starts, Ulevair kol zos, Amarti inyan chadach, lefare shitas mahadrin, and that goes according to the Rambam, and he claims that Tosfos also agrees with the Rambam, that there's only one mad. He says the following. Why is there only one mad? He's not aware of the Brisker Rav who came, a half a century later. He's working with the following premise, that the mitzvah of Heker and Pirsum Anes is chal on the madlik. He's the one who's obligated to be mafarsem the nes. And he says that if he can be mafarsem the nes to more and more people, that enhances his kiyum mitzvah pirsum anes. And therefore, when he adds candles, keneged the people in the household, for him, that's a more intense, increased kiyum of pirsum anes. Shalaishi yeshlo bnei bayis merubim. Eina pirsum nechshav al yidei ner echad. It's not a significant person when he only lights one candle. But in Yagdil Isek HaPirsum, if he mispar kibbutz b'nei beso, then Nikar HaPirsum. And Tzorech LaHagdilos HaPirsum Anes. Ikar HaPirsum Achiv Mutal Balabayis. That's why the Rambam and Tosfos insist that the Balabayis is lighting the candles, because it's his responsibility, obligation to fulfill Pirsum Anes. The Afal Pishikar Mitzvah Dai, Shabal Bais Yadlik Rak Ner Echad, Roy Lassos Pirsum, he should intensify the Pirsum, and that's Mahadru, Lefi Erech Mispar Anshe Beso. But again, he is intensifying his action of Pirsum. I mean, that's a breakthrough. Lefi Erech Mispar Anshe Beso. Imrav, Tarbu Aneros, in my David Eres Muatran, Pasuk in Shkolim. Ach eno inyan shekol echad v'echad mi'anshe beso yadlik bi'atzmo. Achiyu v'rak al bal bais atzmo lefarsem es hanes v'yarbe o yamet. So again, he reiterates, after going through the Rambam and the 80 candles of the Rambam, He reiterates that Kol Inyan Mitzvahs Hadlaka and Pirsum is Mutal Chiyuva al Balabais Atzma. Okay. Again, I'm trying to skip because we don't have time here, even though every word here is important. He's medayik so many diyukim in order to prove this yisod. Ume'ata. I'm skipping to the next paragraph. Lo kasha. He's going to answer his shaila al svaras hatosos. Shekol anshe batim b'chotzer holchim umadlikim al pesach hachotzer. V'sha'alnu, and we asked, Im kein leka hekera. Dizeh vadei hadloka osa mitzvah. V'ikar hekera sricha shiyeh b'shas hadloka. Im kein b'shah sheyovo echad mibalei habatim shebechatze v'yadlik hadneros. V'yosef b'chol laila v'laila. Now he's up to the Mahajim Minamahajim, because again, Tosa says that if he's adding candles connected b'nei abayis, then he doesn't have the number of candles that reflect the yomim, tosefes yomim of kol laila v'laila. But let's say we opt in favor of mahajim v'namahajim. Is yesh hakera b'shas hadloka? How many candles is he lighting? And that's going to define his action and his heker hanes at the shas hadloka. V'hu madlik mispar hayomin. He is lighting the number of days. V'chein kishayovel achakach balbayis sheni v'yadlik gamken neros kemispar leilos. Why is he adding candles? And the answer is that every night successively he is adding one candle. Yesh heker b'shas hadlaka. In other words, each hadlaka is an opportunity to create a heker by adding candles. And that obligation is incumbent upon the balabayis, who is lighting a hadlaka with a piercing in it. Okay, we're going to have to, but again, Rabbosai, this is such an important element of the equation, which I don't see mentioned here in the Hegyonei Halacha, just Lefi Aniyas Daiti. The idea is that we create a separate unit for facilitating the Balabayis's maximum kiyum of Pirsum HaNes. It's his own personal obligation to be mafarsim the nes. On the Mahadran level, he fulfills that expanded obligation by adding candles connected anshe abayis. On the level of Mahadran, he adds candles connected yomim anichnasim yom hayotzim kol laila v'laila. And those numbers are his action of pirsum hanes vis-a-vis his chiyuv hadlaka, which is a kiyum in the bias and enhances the mitzvah of ner ishu beso, even though he's lighting it in the chatzir. And that's the halacha in chovas hamadlik. As one adlaka, there's only one single adlaka that clinches and maximizes pirsum hanes for that unit of a bias by fulfilling ner ishu beso in an enhanced manner, adding, as it were, to the number of candles. Okay, Rav say this is where we're going to stop. And I know you have many questions, but it's almost Shkia here in this parts of the world.
Yeah.
And so next week should be good, as far as I know. And let me wish everyone a freilich Chanukah. And thank you so much.
Thank you. Family also.